Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program, January 27, 2023.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? Thank you very much for coming out on this sunny day when you could be out doing a bear dipping in the lake or any number of things. I'm Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here, and this is our first program of our 2023 schedule. I would welcome you to go to the programs page of our website to see our other offerings because we have a full year. First, let me introduce members of our board who are present. Deke Eigelhart, Greg Major, who, by the way, has stepped forward to become our new secretary, filling the almost unfillable shoes of Joe Rokas. But we're looking great things there, Greg. No pressure. Craig Raines, who's one of the founding members. I mean, he should have a Thrive, one of those Thrive hats on. Who am I missing here? Oh yes, Tom Newbig, who is one of our newest members, and I think that's it. And of course, Jill, I was looking for you.
Sitting in between these two illustrious
Other directors, yes. Okay, and Jill Eigelhart. So I bet we're the only organization at this lake that has a husband and wife on the board. Cool, huh? But anyway, all right. So I've already told you that Greg has taken on the responsibilities of secretary, and myself. Boggs Wright as treasurer, and Jack Finn as vice president accepted new 3-year terms to pad Thank you. We're attempting to pad our resumes. And this is actual work, unlike the 3rd District of New York. Anyway. Okay, so there we are. Once again, our 2023 schedule is on the website, so please look at that. The whole year schedule is filled, but it's never too late to start on next year. So please, our Vice President, Jack Finn, has just walked into the room. He's the one with the dark glasses back there. But in any event, if you have an idea for a speaker or an idea for anything that would be of benefit to the club and those that attend these sessions, please contact us. There is a contact link on our website, so or else if you look up our phone numbers, etc., we'll be glad to talk to you because we need help. If you have found that you enjoy and appreciate these programs, I invite you to step forward with ideas as well as time and talent. As you probably know from your own experience as a volunteer and officer of groups such as this, like others, there's a dedicated core of people that keep things running. But we always could use new, and in our case, well, not Jill's case, but we could a younger blood and new ideas. So please don't be shy. Speak to any of us, and thanks very much for your consideration. As you know, our group tries to shed light on the Civil War mostly, but also on other issues of local history. And part of that history resides in this building just down the hall. About 11 years ago, the LOW Woodworker Club partnered with us to build a cabinet. Well, okay, they did the building, we did the design. To display Civil War related artifacts drawn from local ground. I'm sure most of you have had an opportunity to see that. We've had an issue with lighting in the past number of years, and thanks to the persistence and leadership of our Vice President Jack Finn, we have now installed new expanded LED lighting that will use less energy, so the clubhouse profits should go up. So take time to visit the case before you leave today or on a future visit to the clubhouse. Almost to the speaker. Our website has been updated to show information about our February 24th meeting in this space. The speaker is Kevin Powlack, and he's speaking on Antietam Endgame, the conclusion of Lee's Maryland invasion, September 18th to 20th, 1862. Kevin is one of the authors and speakers in the Emerging Civil War series, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. And then this year, our annual dinner will be in the evening on March 24th. Our speaker will be retired National Park Service historian Don Fance. I'm sure most of you have heard him give talks before or read his postings on what is the blog, something in Conundrums. But in any event, his topic will be negligence on the right, the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville. And so that will be almost 160 years to the date, because that happened in May of 1863, right? Not 160 years to date of the Gordon's flank attack, which of course gave the 11th Corps a little bit of trouble. But in any event, there on our homepage, there's a link to a form that you can fill out to make a reservation for this dinner. It's going to be limited a number of seats available, so please look at that as soon as you can, and we won't accept any invitations, any reservations received after March the 17th, the week before the dinner, and you know the U.S. Postal Service these days, so think ahead. Anyway. So our speaker today is fellow Lake of the Woods resident Bob Stone, who has addressed us several times before. Bob has a BS in education from West Virginia University. He began to study the Civil War while still in his preteen years. That's a lot of time. When his non-reconstructed Confederate aunt gave him a Christmas present of a book on Robert E. Lee. For many years, he has taught the Civil War curriculum at Encore Learning of Arlington County, Virginia, which is an affiliate organization of George Mason University, which offers college-level courses to retired adults. And speaking of something that I'm sure most teachers would love is students that really want to learn. So you have the best of a lot of worlds there. He has given talks to Civil War roundtables and other like-minded groups, and has led numerous tours of battlefields in the Eastern Theater of the War. Bob last spoke to us on the issue of notable women in February of 2020. Today he revisits that topic with additional insight. So please welcome Bob.
I got interested in this topic in 2019 because the next year was going to be the year of the woman and 100th year of the vote. And so I was preparing this as a 2-hour presentation at our Arlington Library, and that went away. The whole year of 2020, except for the February one here, just messed it up. So this is the second half of a 2-hour presentation. I'm going to be reading these because I don't want to leave anything out, because these women, most of these women very, very, very much in this document. Okay. My interest in the topic started when I read the book Liar, Temptress, Soldier, and Spy, written by Karen Abbott. In this book, Ms. Abbott profiles 4 women of the Civil War era who matched the descriptions of that book's title. This led me to a book called Notable Women in American History, written by Linda G. Adamson, which in turn led me to the 6-volume book History of Women's Suffrage. This is volume 1 cover, written by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Matilda Cage, and published by the National Women's Suffrage Association. These books gave me a long list of women who performed unusual service in the Civil War, some for the North and some from the South. So my presentation today will be 13 women. I've taken one out. And the impact of women in the Civil War, I think you all know that American society of the mid-19th century was male-dominated. Women were not allowed to vote or serve as elected representatives. They were not allowed to be physicians. They could not join the military in any official capacity. They were not allowed to work outside the home. They were vilified and sometimes physically harmed if they became activists. The 6th-volume History of the Women's Suffrage Movement argues that the frontline service on the battlefield by women disguised as men proved that women should be accorded the same rights as male defenders of the Republic. Everybody knows Clara Barton. She was, of course, a nurse and an activist. She claimed that the Civil War advanced the social position of women by 50 years. First, let me say that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of women in both the North and South were affected by the Civil War. From a strongly patriarchal society, these women had to adjust when they were thrust into the new situation where they had to take control of the home environment and many times had to work outside the home to provide for the family. There were many women who had to, for the first time in their lives, request financial aid and other help from their friends and community. Now let's examine how some of the more notable women dealt with these massive social changes that the Civil War started by becoming soldiers, nurses, doctors, activists. Put it here. And writers, things that average American women of the mid-1800s just did not do. Women soldiers. Historians have tried to take on the question of how many women fought as men in the Civil War, but there's not been a consensus reached. The best number I can give you today is that about 750 total women, North and South, fought as soldiers during the war. But we will never know, because most of the women who did this heroic service did not want to be found out, so they just blended back into their communities and never said another word. Most of the women that we know of today that were soldiers were either discovered by a physician after being injured or wounded, or they were in such dire straits after the war that they applied for a soldier's pension. The Southern women who were unmasked during their service were sent home, but there were some cases where they were returned to duty. The Northern women who were discovered were subject to military justice for impersonating the soldier. The majority of them were sent home. Now I know the first question you would ask is how did they pass the military physical? Well, there wasn't any military physical. So they took every able-bodied person and felt lucky to get all of them. One unique aspect of women becoming soldiers was the fact that neither side had a written rule about how to treat these women in combat situations or if they were captured. This problem was partially solved by the Union Army with the writing of the Lieber Codes, or Special Order Number 100, which were adopted on April 24, 1863. The codes were written more for how to handle the issue of black troops and their families that were now being recruited for the Emancipation Proclamation. But some of the provisions also applied to women combatants. So let's start looking at these women. There's Albert DJ's cashier, who's really Jeannie Irene Hodges. Jeannie Irene Hodges was born on Christmas Day in 1843 in Clogherhead, County Louth, Ireland. She immigrated to America as a teenager to live with an uncle in Illinois. Her uncle dressed her as a man so that she could find work in an all-male shoe factory. And Jenny kept up that identity for the rest of her life, calling herself Albert DJ Cashier. In this way, she was able to lead the totally independent lifestyle that she desired. When President Lincoln called for more volunteer troops in 1862 to put down the rebellion, Albert Cashier enlisted in the 95th Illinois Infantry for a 3-year term and was assigned to Company G. After some training at Camp Fuller, the recruits for the 95th Illinois were put on steamers and railroads and joined up with their regiment in the Army of Tennessee under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant. The regiment participated in the siege of Vicksburg in May and June of 1863, and in this action, Cashier was captured while performing a reconnaissance mission. After escaping her captors, Cashier contracted chronic diarrhea and was hospitalized for the condition, somehow managing to evade detection as a woman. After her recovery, Cashier fought in all the battles and actions of the 95th Illinois until she was discharged on August 17, 1865. After the war, Cashier returned to Belvedere, Illinois, and found work as a farmhand while continuing to live as a man. She would move to Saudanem, Illinois in 1869 and worked as a church janitor and cemetery worker and street lamplighter. She would vote in the local elections, and she would claim for and receive a veteran's pension. In 1911, Cashier was working for the state senator Ira Lish when she was hit by the senator's car and broke her leg. The attending physician discovered her deception, but agreed to keep it confidential. No longer able to work because of her injury, Cashier was moved to the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Quincy, Illinois. Many of her friends and fellow soldiers in the 95th Illinois visited her there and still had no idea she was not. In 1914, Cashier was transferred to the Watertown State Hospital for the insane because her mind had deteriorated so much after her injury in 1911. Attendants at the hospital discovered Cashier's sex and at that point made her wear women's clothing again for the first time in 50 years. The hospital reported the deception by Cashier to the Veterans Pension Fund, and that board launched an investigation for fraud. Former comrades in arms confirmed that Cashier was in fact the person who fought in the Civil War, and the board decided in February 1915 to continue her pension payments. That life did not last long after this fraud investigation, as Albert D.J. Cashier, Jeannie Irene Hodges, died on October 10, 1915. She was buried in her military uniform, and her tombstone is inscribed, Albert D.J. Cashier, Company G, 94th Illinois Infantry. Her funeral service was given by the Grand Army of the Republic, and she was buried with full military honors. In 1970, a second tombstone inscribed with both of her names, was placed next to the first one at the Sunny Slope Cemetery in Saunanim, Illinois. Cashier is listed on the internal wall of the Illinois Memorial at Vicksburg National Military Park. A musical drama called The Civility of Albert Cashier was produced and based on her life. A biography of Cashier was written by Alon P. Dawson, who lived at the Illinois Veteran Home with her, and it's called, as known as Albert D. J. Cashier, the Jeannie Rogers Story. A novel called My First Skirt, written by Linda Durant, is based on her life. She was the subject of one of the essays in a collection called 9 Irish Lives, with her biography being written by Jill McDonald. Now the next lady that was supposedly a military person, Loretta Janetta Velasquez, was born in June 26, 1842 in Havana, Cuba. She wrote a book of memoirs that was published in 1876, confessing that she had served as a soldier in the Confederate Army of Tennessee. The book's title is probably one of the longest titles in history. Quote, "The Women in Battle, a narrative of the exploits, adventures, and travels of Madame Loretta Janetta Velasquez, otherwise known as Lieutenant Harry T. Leesburg, Confederate States Army." You need a couple breaths to do that. She claims that she fought at the siege of Fort Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh. Her true gender was discovered when she was in New Orleans. She then claims that she became a Confederate spy, working in both male and female disguises. She also claims that she was actually reporting to the U.S. Secret Service. Her first husband died while training soldiers on how to load and fire their muskets. Her second husband died shortly after the war. She claims she went to Europe to see the sights. There she met and married a third husband who took her to Venezuela. That husband also died, so she moved back to the United States and settled in Nevada. While living there, she married her fourth husband. The date of her death is unknown, but some scholarship says it was in 1923. Now, William C. Davis is a very good Civil War historian, and he wrote an article in one of the Civil War magazines, said in October 2016, said, noted Civil War author William C. Davis published a book named Loretta Velasquez, Confederate soldier impersonator, media celebrity, and con artist. Now we're going to go to some activists. You all probably know the name of Sojourner Truth. Her real name is Isabella Baumfree. She was born into slavery in 1797 at Swarthville, New York. In 1828, she escaped slavery with her infant daughter, and shortly thereafter, the state of New York abolished slavery. She then went to court to recover her son in 1828, and she became the first black woman to win a case against a white man. She gave herself the name of Sojourner Truth in 1843, after she became convinced that God called her to go into the countryside and, quote, testifying the hope that was in her, unquote. Her best-known speech was done at 1851 Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. The speech became widely known as Ain't I a Woman's Speech. Her speeches were about emancipation and about women's rights. Truth first lived in Northampton, Massachusetts area, but 1857 she decided to move to Battle Creek, Michigan to join her friends from the Millerite movement, which is what the present-day Adventists call it. Both Michigan and Ohio had strong anti-slavery movements starting, and she wanted to help in that endeavor. During the Civil War, Truth helped recruit black troops for the Union Army. Her grandson, James Caldwell, enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment that was in the movie Glory. In 1864, she moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the recently started National Freedmen's Relief Association. And in October of that year, she met with President Abraham Lincoln. In 1865, while working in the Freedmen's Hospital, Truth rode in the city streetcars to help force their desegregation in D.C. After the Civil War ended, Truth moved back to Michigan, but she continued to travel all over the East Coast, giving speeches on abolition, women's rights, prison reform, and against capital punishment. She had many staunch supporters among the influential people of the time, many including Amy Post, Parker Pillsbury, Francis Cade, William Lloyd Garrison, Susan B. Anthony, and many, many more. In 1870, she tried to secure land grants from the federal government for former enslaved people, the old 40 acres and a mule promise by Sherman. A project she pursued unsuccessfully for 7 years. While in Washington, she met with President Ulysses S. Grant in the White House about the land grants. After returning to Michigan, she became an active campaigner for Grant's 1872 election. And she even tried to vote on Election Day, but she was turned away at the polling place. Sojourner Truth died on November 26, 1883 in Battle Creek, Michigan. The calendar of saints of the Episcopal Church remembers her on July 20th each year. And the calendar of saints in the Lutheran Church remember her on March 10th. A larger-than-life sculpture of Sojourner Truth, done by Tina Allen, sits in the Battle Creek Monument Park. Other statues of her in Florence, Massachusetts, and on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. And I couldn't find out why, all the way over there. On September 19, 2018, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, announced the name of the last ship of a 6-unit construction contract as the USNS Sojourner Truth. We go to another Maryland woman, Anna Ella Carroll. Here's another Maryland, but this time it is a white woman who was born to a very wealthy and prominent family. Anna Ella Carroll was born near Pocomoke City, Maryland in 1815 to a family that included a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, a governor of Maryland, and a member of the First United States Congress. She was the oldest of 8 children. At the eldest, her father, Thomas King Carroll, educated and trained her to be his aide on the tobacco plantation in Somerset County, including her studying his law books. This allowed her access into the male world of politics. Anna contributed to her family's income by establishing a girls' school at their home, Kingston Hall. She also began to get interested in politics, so she joined the American Party, which was the Know-Nothing Party in 1854. Anna's writing skills served her and the party well, as she published 2 books for the party that greatly extended her political and press contacts. One was The Great American Battle, and the other book was The Star of the West. She also produced influential pamphlets such as The Union of the States, which carried criticism of the political influence of the Roman Catholic Church under the papacy of Pius IX. In 1857, Anna was selected to be the chief publicist for the Maryland governor, Thomas H. Hicks. He credited his victory to her work. In 1858, she took up the cause of former Congressman John Minor Botts from Culpeper, right off 29, his farm right there. In his unsuccessful presidential bid, she published a series of articles in the New York Evening Express newspaper on the presidential candidates in the 1860 election under the pseudonym of Hancock. With the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of Deep South states, Anna began to work during secession in Maryland and working to keep the state in the Union. She was also free of all her slaves. Her father had died and she was freed those slaves. During the summer of 1861, Carroll wrote a political pamphlet in response to a speech in the Senate by John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Breckinridge had argued that Lincoln had acted in violation of the Constitution by mustering state militias into service, by suspending the writ of habeas corpus, and by imposing martial law and a naval blockade. Anna's pamphlet, which would be widely circulated by the Lincoln administration and later used by the Attorney General of the United States, argued that Lincoln could use all of his powers in accordance with the Constitution because he was the commander-in-chief of all the military forces. Anna would write 3 more pamphlets on this subject, and they became the basis for what we call today the President's War Powers Act. In the fall of 1861, Anna traveled to St. Louis to work with a secret agent about the feasibility of a Union invasion of Texas. The information that she gathered led her to report that the best way to invade the Confederacy was to use the Tennessee and Cumberland Rivers to split them in half. This is the exact strategy that Ulysses S. Grant used in February of 1862 at Forts Henry and Donelson. Carroll's role in this strategy was kept secret until well after the war. At that time, Anna gave credit to Captain Charles Scott, who gave her the information. Years later, Assistant Secretary of War Charles Scott and Senator Wade testified before Congress about her critical role in the war. For the rest of the Civil War, Anna worked for the Lincoln White House pertaining to the issues of emancipation and colonization of American slaves. Although she advised Lincoln not to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, she assured him that the War Powers Act would be taken under the Constitution legally. After the war, Carroll spent 20 years of her life trying to get payment of $5,000 that she claimed the federal government owed her for the wartime publications that she produced. Although she testified before many congressional committees about this debt, no bill was ever passed to pay the debt. She filed a claim in the United States Court of Claims in 1888. The claim was denied. Anna L. Carroll died of Bright's disease on February 19, 1894 at her home in Church Creek. She's buried in the family plot in the old Trinity Church graveyard. The epitaph on her tombstone reads in part, quote, "A woman rarely gifted, an able and accomplished writer." The National Women's Suffrage Association commissioned a biography of Anna Carroll in 1891, written by Sarah Ellen Blackwell. In 1959, the Maryland Historical Society unveiled a monument to her with the words, quote, "Maryland's most distinguished lady." Now let's look over into spies. Mary Elizabeth Bowser, also named Mary Jane Richards, was born into slavery in Richmond, Virginia in 1846 to the Van Lew family. I gave a talk on the Van Lew family last in February of 2020. The first official record of Mary Jane was her baptism at the St. John's Church in Richmond. It was an unusual one for slaves to be baptized in St. John's. They were normally taken to the African Baptist Church. So this was an unusual treatment for Mary Jane, and shows that the Van Lews thought very, very highly of her. Now, this picture is of a Mary Richard Bowser, and everybody had, for many, many, many years, thought this was the Mary Elizabeth Bowser. But nobody came up with another picture. There was no picture they could find that was a Mary Elizabeth Bowser, so I just stuck that. That's probably what they would look like in dress and stuff. As a young girl, Mary Jane was sent to the Van Lewes to Princeton, New Jersey for schooling. In 1855, she was allowed to go to Liberia, West Africa, to join a missionary community as arranged directly by Elizabeth Van Lew. She returned to Richmond by the spring of 1860. Mary Jane Richard married Wilson Bowser on April 16, 1861, just 4 days after the firing on Fort Sumter. Through her contacts, Elizabeth Van Lew was able to get Mary Bowser a job as a servant in the Confederate White House for Jefferson and Verina Davis. Mary became part of the Van Lew underground spy ring and was credited with obtaining important information which was passed on to Union officers through Elizabeth Van Lew. After the fall of Richmond, Mary started working as a teacher for former slaves in the city. In late 1865, she traveled north to give speeches about her education, her travel to Liberia, and her wartime exploits. She used fake names at all lectures to protect her identity. She founded a freedmen's school in St. Mary's, Georgia, in early 1867 under her married name of Bowser. Later, she asked the superintendent of the St. Mary's School to change her name on the records to Mary J.R. Garvin. After this time, there's no further record of Mary Elizabeth Bowser, Mary Richard, or Mary J.R. Garvin. A novel by Lois Levine, The Secrets of Mary Bowser, is based on her life. A play written by Ted Lang, Lady Patriot, details her exploits. Mary Elizabeth Bowser was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame for her work during the Civil War. Now this is another lady that you've probably heard of. Isabella Maria Bell Boyd was born in Martinsburg, Virginia, now West Virginia, on May 8, 1844. The oldest child of the Boyds. Bell's father, Benjamin Boyd, operated a hotel in Front Royal, and his family lived in the house nearby. Bell would describe her childhood as idyllic, living a carefree life of a reckless tomboy who climbed trees, raced through the woods, and dominated her brothers and sisters and cousins. Despite the family's middle-class income, Bell received a very good education by attending the Mount Washington Female College in Baltimore. According to Bell, in her fictionalized 1866 account, Bell Boyd in Camden Prison, still being in print, her career as a spy for the Confederates started quite by chance on July the 4th, 1861. A band of Union soldiers heard that the Boyds had Confederate flags in the hotel, and they came to investigate. The soldiers hung a Union flag outside the hotel, and this action made Bell very angry. When she voiced her disapproval of their act, one of the soldiers cursed at her and grabbed her mother, and this enraged Bell. She pulled out a pistol and shot the man to death. The military board exonerated her, but sentries were posted around the house, and officers kept close track of her activities. One evening in May of 1862, Union General James Shield and his staff gathered in the parlor of the hotel to discuss strategy. Bell hid in the closet of the room and eavesdropped on their conversation. Later that night, Bell rode through the Union lines to report the information that she had heard to Colonel Turner Ashby, Stonewall Jackson's cavalry commander. On May 23, 1862, Bell heard that Jackson's men were approaching the southern end of the town, so she ran under Union fire to greet Jackson. Her skirt and handbag had a number of bullet holes in them when she finally arrived at Jackson's headquarters. Bell told one of Jackson's staff, quote, The Yankee force is very small. Tell Jackson just to charge right down and he'll catch them all. Unquote. Jackson did just as she directed, and he won the battle of Front Royal. That evening, Jackson penned a note of gratitude to her, saying, quote, "I thank you for myself and for my army for the immense service that you have rendered your country today." Jackson made her an honorary captain and an aide de camp. Bell was arrested again in July of '62 and sent to the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. A military inquiry was held on August 7, 1862, and Bell was released on August 29th. After the release, the Union forces took her to Fort Monroe, where she was exchanged for a Union prisoner. In March 1864, she attempted to travel to England, but was intercepted by a Union blockade ship and taken to Canada and dropped off. There she met naval officer Samuel Wild Harding. These two later married in England and had one child, a daughter. When her husband died in 1866, Bell became an actress to support her family. She eventually returned to America on November 11, 1869. Bell married John Hammond in New Orleans, but then divorced him. She then married Nathaniel High in 1885. Later, she began touring the country, giving dramatic lectures about her life as a Civil War spy. During the tour on June 11, 1900, 56-year-old Belle Boyd died of a heart attack in Kilbourne City, now known as Wisconsin Dells. And she's buried there in the Spring Grove Cemetery. Although much of what she wrote in her memoirs about spying activities that cannot be substantiated by any official record, there's no question that her activities in May of 1862 with Stonewall Jackson were real and did help Jackson devise a plan to rout the Union forces. Belle Boyd is the main character in at least 5 historical novels of the last 60 years, and her bullet-ridden handbag was the feature artifact on the episode of the TV game show Legends of Human Temple. Now we're going to talk about some writers. How am I doing on time? Matilda J. Tilly Pierce was born in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on March 11, 1848. Tilly's first encounter with Confederate soldiers was on June 25, 1863, when Jubal Early's men came through town and passed her home. And they helped themselves to all the mercantile stores in the city. Tilly had started a diary, as most young girls did those days. She recognized that now was a great chance to record history. Her parents, fearing for her safety, sent her to the Jacob Weicker farm, which was just east of the Round Tops. On the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Tilly walked up the Evergreen Cemetery, and she watched the Federal artillery setting up their cannon for battle. Tilly wrote down everything she saw before she had the Union artillerymen told her to leave. She was returning to the Weicker house, and she could see the Confederates pushing back the Union into town. One of her most vivid memories was seeing a Union ambulance filled with dead soldiers stopped at what became General Meade's headquarters. On the second and third days of the battle, the Weicker family was under siege from the advancing Confederates, trying to take the Round Tops. The Weicker house became a hospital, and Tilly volunteered to help the soldiers, bringing in the meals and writing soldiers' letters home and sitting with the wounded. She spent a lot of time with one soldier whose name she didn't know until the next morning. Finding out that this soldier had died during the night, she asked a nurse, did she know this man's name? She was told that the soldier she comforted was General Stephen H. Weed, who had been shot dead on a little Round Top. After the battle was over, Tilly volunteered to assist the nurses at Camp Letterman General Hospital. On September 28, 1871, Tilly Pierce with Horace Alleman at the Christ Lutheran Church in Gettysburg. Her husband was a Civil War veteran and a graduate of Gettysburg College. The couple moved to Snyder County, Pennsylvania. In 1880, Tilly started to put all of her notes about the war into a book. It took her until 1889 to find a publisher. The book called, quote, At Gettysburg, or What a Girl Saw and Heard of the Battle of a True Narrative. Yeah, unquote. It's still in print, even though it's now in the public domain. Tilly died in 1914 in Philadelphia. Mary Chestnut was born in March 1823 in Statesburg, South Carolina, on her maternal grandparents' plantation called Mount Pleasant. She was the oldest of 4 children. She had a brother and 2 sisters. The family lived in Charleston, South Carolina. Her father had served in South Carolina as a U.S. representative, a governor, and then a U.S. senator. Mary started her formal education at the age of 13 at Madame Talbante's French School for Young Ladies. Mary received a strong education, becoming fluent in both French and German. After leaving politics, Mary's father took his family to Mississippi, where he bought extensive acreage, owning 3 cotton plantations and hundreds of slaves. Mary lived in Mississippi for a short time, but she was much more fond of Charleston. April 23rd, on 1840, Mary married James Chestnut, Jr., who was 8 years her senior. The newlyweds lived with James' family on a plantation called Mulberry, near Camden, South Carolina. James's father owned about 5 square miles of land around Camden, and he owned over 500 slaves. In 1858, James Jr. was elected a U.S. Senator in South Carolina and served in that capacity until South Carolina seceded from the Union in 1860. Once the Civil War broke out, James became an aide to President Jefferson Davis and was commissioned a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. When not in Richmond, the couple resided in Columbia, South Carolina. Mary started keeping her diary on February 18, 1861, and it ended on June 26, 1865. She wrote at the beginning of the diary, quote, "This journal is intended to be entirely objective. My subjective days are over." Unquote. Because of her husband's position in the Confederate government, she was an eyewitness to many historic events as she accompanied him to significant sites of the Civil War. He was much aware of the historical importance of what she was witnessing and tried to give a detailed view of Southern society and the mixed roles of women and men. Surprisingly, for a woman who grew up on a slave plantation, she was very forthright about the complex situations related to slavery, particularly the abuses of black women's sexuality and the power exercised by the white men. When she wrote about white planters fathering mixed-race children, she very much opposed to that. Mary's writing skills noticeably developed over 4+ years of her journal. She enjoyed the writing process so much that she wrote 3 full novels based on incidents that happened during the war. Mary never published any of her writings, but she did start preparing her journal for publication in 1881 and had it ready by 1884. Because she was in poor health, Mary gave the edited journal to her friend, Isabella D. Martin, and urged her to have it published after Mary's death. That death came on November 22nd, 1886 at her home. Isabella Martin first published a heavily abridged version of the journal in 1905 and called it, quote, "A Diary from Dixie." The novelist Ben Adams Williams published a much more readable version in 1949, but he left out a lot of the historical material. It was in 1981 that Civil War historian C. Van Woodward published the only annotated version that retained all of her original work. Woodward called the book Mary Chestnut's Civil War. And this book won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1982. Influential writer Edmund Wilson called the book, quote, a work of art, a masterpiece of the genre, and the most important work by a Confederate art author. After the success of Woodward's version of the journal, Elizabeth Mullenfield of the University of Virginia Press edited 2 of her novels and published them. And she wrote a biography of Chestnut. Ken Burns used extensive reading from Mary Chestnut's in his documentary series, The Civil War, using the voice of Academy Award-nominated actress Julie Harris as Mary Chestnut. Now, I found I had 146 ladies that I had to research out of a lot of them. And I found that most of them were in the medical field. So these last few here will be the medical field. I found that more than 1/3 of the women I identified as notable were in the medical field. In researching deeper, I discovered that female doctors were almost non-existent prior to the Civil War. And that situation held true for female nurses or hospital administrators. Wartime opened up these fields for women, but the United States and Confederate armies did not welcome the change. Many of the women that went into the medical field during the Civil War experienced extremely bad treatment from the established army doctors. The establishment of the U.S. Sanitary Commissions and the like groups gave female medical personnel a kinder reception than the armies. We had Clara Barton early on. Clara Barton was born on Christmas Day, 1821, in North Oxford, Massachusetts. She was the youngest child in the family. Her father was a farmer and a horse breeder and a respected community leader. Her 2 brothers and 2 sisters were given the job of educating Clara at the age of 16. A phrenologist advised her to become a teacher to cure her shyness. Clara followed this advice and got a job teaching in Worcester County, Massachusetts. She took a liking to teaching, and at age 23, she opened her own school back in her hometown. She took time off from teaching to seek a higher education at the Liberal Institute in Clinton, New York, an advanced school for female teachers. After graduating from Liberal Institute, she took a job with a private subscription school in Bordertown, New Jersey. Seeing the need for free public education in Bordertown, she convinced some citizens to form a school board and open a public school in a donated building. The school grew from 6 students at the start to the end of the year at 600 students. So good news passed really good. When the school board appointed a man to become a paid principal, Clara said, quote, I quit. I may sometimes be willing to teach for nothing, but if paid at all, I shall never do a man's work for less than a man's pay. Clara moved to Washington, D.C. in 1854 and took a job as a clerk in the United States Patent Office, the first woman to work in the United States Patent Office. When the Civil War broke out, she resigned her position at the Patent Office and became a volunteer nurse. She advertised for donations of medical supplies, socks, and other goods that would help the wounded. In 1862, she was granted permission by the War Department to deliver her donated supplies, and she did so at the battlefields of Antietam and Fredericksburg, 2 of the bloodiest battles of the war. In 1864, Clara was appointed the superintendent of Union nurses. After the war, she founded the American Red Cross, based on the organization of the one she found in her European travels. One of the more recent discoveries about Clara Barton's post-war activities is the founding of the Office of Missing Soldiers, directly approved by President Lincoln just before his assassination. This office had its objective of finding Union soldiers, probably mostly dead, that had never been accounted for in the official record. Among other travels, she made a trip to Andersonville Prison in Georgia to record the names of the 13,000 Union soldiers that died there. This activity had received attention because of the actual office in Washington, D.C.'s Gallery Place neighborhood that Clara operated out of has been discovered and renovated and is now open to the public on limited hours. It's over by the, used to be the Verizon Center, where they play the basketball and the hockey. Clara served as president of the American Red Cross until 1904, when she was forced out of her position. She then lived in her home in Glen Echo, Maryland, until her death in April 1912. Now the next lady, Mary Edward Walker, born November 26, 1832, in Oswego, New York. She was the youngest of 7 children, 5 sisters and 1 brother. Her parents' non-traditional thinking nurtured Mary's spirit of independence and sense of justice that she demonstrated throughout her life. The Walker parents also demonstrated non-traditional gender roles to their children regarding sharing work around the farm and what clothing to wear. As you'll notice, Mary is in male clothing. Mary's elementary education consisted of an attendance at a local school her parents had founded. She then went on to the Fowley Seminar in Fulton, New York for her higher education. Fowley was a place that emphasized modern social reform in gender roles, education, and hygiene. In her free time, Mary would pore over medical literature, and this is where she got the idea to become a physician. Mary taught at school in Minetta, New York, in order to earn money to pay her tuition to the Syracuse Medical College. She was the only female in her class, and she graduated with honors in 1855. She married a fellow medical student, Albert Miller, on November 16, 1855. At the marriage ceremony, Mary wore a short skirt with trousers underneath, and she refused to include obey in her vows, and she retained her last name. Mary and Albert set up a joint medical practice in Rome, New York, but the practice did not do well because female physicians were generally not trusted or respected at the time. This caused a rift in the marriage, which resulted in a divorce. Mary then attended the Bowen College Institute in Hopkintown, Iowa in 1860. But she was forced to leave after she refused to resign from the debating society, which had always all male before her. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Mary volunteered as a surgeon for the Union Army, but was rejected because she was a woman. She was offered a position as nurse, but declined and sought other ways to help out the Union. The United States Army put every obstacle they had in possession to prevent Dr. Walker from becoming an Army surgeon. She finally relented and served as a nurse at the First Battle of Manassas in July 1861, and at the Patent Office Hospital in Washington, D.C. She then worked as an unpaid field surgeon near the Union lines at the Battle of Fredericksburg and at the Battle of Chattanooga. At Chattanooga, she was employed by the Army of the Cumberland as a contracting acting assistant surgeon, thereby becoming the first female surgeon, paid surgeon of the Union Army. She wore men's clothing during her work. Later, she was appointed assistant surgeon of the 52nd Ohio Infantry. In April 1864, Dr. Walker was captured by Confederate troops just after she finished helping a Confederate surgeon perform an amputation. She was sent to Castle Thunder in Richmond, which was not in a good place, and remained there until August 12, 1864, when she was exchanged for a Confederate surgeon. While in prison, she refused to wear the women's clothes that were provided by her captors. After the war, Walker was awarded a disability pension of $8.50 per month for partial muscular atrophy suffered while in prison. In 1899, this pension was raised to $20 per month. She became a writer and a lecturer, reporting issues, healthcare, temperance, women's rights, dress reform. She was frequently arrested when she was wearing men's clothing. I didn't know that was a felony. She wrote 2 books that discuss women's rights and dress. She became a member of the Central Women's Suffrage Bureau in Washington, and she solicited funds to endow a chair for a female professorship at Howard University Medical School. Dr. Walker was a leading member of an organization that claimed that women already had the right to vote, and Congress only needed to enact enabling legislation. She pushed this position by trying to vote in the 1871 election, but she was turned away at the polls. She fell out of favor with the other leaders of the suffrage movement, mainly because of her penchant for wearing masculine clothing, including a top hat, which I don't see in that picture there. I've seen one other category. She traveled to England, where she received more favorable reception than the United States. Back in the United States, Dr. Walker wrote a pamphlet titled Crowning Constitutional Argument about the right of women to vote. She testified before the U.S. House of Representatives in both 1912 and 1914. After a long illness, Dr. Mary Walker died on February 21st, 1919 in Oswego, New York, just months before women were given the vote. She had a partial military funeral with a flag-draped casket, and she was dressed wearing a black suit of a dress. Her death came just 1 year before the passage of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote. After the war, President Johnson directed Secretary of War Edward Stanton to investigate the issue of awarding Dr. Walker a commission in the U.S. Army retroactively. Stanton said there was no legal grounds which he could allow for that action, so President Johnson awarded her the Congressional Medal of Honor, even though the criteria for the medal did not allow civilians to receive it. In 1916, the U.S. Congress created a pension act for all Medal of Honor recipients, and in so doing, they directed the Army and Navy to review the eligibility of prior recipients. They found out that 911 people who got the Congressional Medal of Honor should not have gotten it, including Dr. Walker. Although these recipients were asked to return their medal, Dr. Walker wore hers with pride until the day she died. In 1977, the Army Board for Corrections of Military Records sent through a request that Dr. Walker's Medal of Honor should be restored to the official records. President Jimmy Carter, after much input from staff and legal opinions, signed the order and reinstated Dr. Walker's Medal of Honor. Dr. Walker was also honored by the National Women's Hall of Fame with induction in 2000. This is Mary Ann Ball Bickerdike. She was born in Knox County, Ohio in July of 1817, enrolled in Oberlin College, one of the first women to attend this school. She married Robert Bickerdike in 1847, and they had 2 sons together. Robert would die in 1859, and Mary would not remarry. Mary began her association with medicine in Galesburg, Illinois, where she primarily worked with the alternative medicines, including herbs and plants. When the Civil War started, she joined the U.S. Sanitary Commission, serving as a nurse at a total of 19 battles. Bickerdike was described as a determined nurse who did not let anything or anyone stand in her way to serve the wounded or sick soldiers. Her patients referred to her as Mother Bickerdike because of her caring nature. When a surgeon once questioned her authority to take a specific action, she replied, quote, "On the authority of God Almighty, have you anything that outranks that?" Her friend and mentor, Dr. Woodward of the 22nd Illinois Infantry, wrote home about the filthy, chaotic military hospitals at Cairo, Illinois, and asked the citizens of Galesburg to donate money to help. He also suggested that Mary Ann Bickerdike was the best person to deliver these donations and get the hospitals in good shape. From this experience, Mary Ann Bickerdike became a hospital administrator for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the first hospital administrator being a woman. She was responsible for establishing 300 field hospitals during the war, and she was so beloved by the soldiers, they would cheer her whenever she appeared. At General Sherman's request, she rode at the head of the 15th Corps in the Grand Review down in Washington after the war. After the war, Mary Ann became an attorney and specialized in helping war veterans with their legal problems, including pensions. She helped a group of 50 veterans move to Salina, Kansas as homesteaders, and then she went there and built a hotel, the Bickerdike House. General Logan helped her get a job in the San Francisco Mint, and she also worked with the Salvation Army in San Francisco. On May 9, 1886, Congress passed and the President signed a bill awarding Mary Ann Bickerdike a special pension of $25 per month for her service to the nation. Generals Grant and Sherman testified to this in Congress. With this pension, Mary Ann was able to retire to Bunker Hill, Kansas to live with one of her sons. She died after a stroke in 1901 and was taken home to Galesburg for burial. Clara Barton wrote a poem entitled "The Women Who Went to the Field," and unquote, and that honored Mary Ann Bickerdike and 4 other field nurses. Statues of her have been erected in Galesburg, Illinois, and Mount Vernon, Ohio. The U.S. Navy honored her by naming a hospital ship and liberty ship the SS Mary Bickerdike. Now, 2 more. This is Susie King Taylor, born enslaved on a plantation in Liberty, Georgia, on August 6, 1848. She was named Susan Baker. When she was about 7 years old, her owner allowed her to go to Savannah to live with her grandmother, Dolly. Despite the harsh laws Georgia had against the education of African Americans, Dolly supported Susan's education by sending her to an illegal school run by free black women named Woodhouse. After learning all she could from Mrs. Woodhouse, Susie continued her education under the tutelage of various teachers, both black and white, including the son of Dolly's landlord. Susie's education stopped when she was forced to return to her mother on the Isle of Wight after Dolly was arrested for singing freedom songs in church. Her mother was working and living in Fort Pulaski, but when the Civil War started, South Carolina troops seized control of the fort. The Union took back Fort Pulaski in early spring of '62, and Susie and her family then moved on to St. Catherine's Island, where they were protected by the federal troops. Soon, the African-American refugees were moved on to the St. Simon Island, where the Union had a large supply depot. The commander of the Union forces on St. Simon were very impressed with Susie's ability to read and write, so he was offered a job of running a school for black children and adults on the island. She thereby became the first black teacher for free African-American students in Georgia. While teaching school in St. Simon's, Susie met and married Edward King, a black non-commissioned officer of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, later named the 33rd United States Colored Troop. For 3 years, she moved with her husband's regiment, serving as a nurse and laundress and teaching many black soldiers to read and write. She was the first black Army nurse to attend to Union troops. And like all the rest of the African American nurses that came after her, she was never paid for her service. After the war, she and her husband returned to Savannah, where she established a school for freed children, and her husband took a job at the war. In September 1866, her husband died in a work-related accident, unloading a ship, just 3 months prior to the birth of their first child. Susie closed her school, moved back to Liberty County to establish another one, but quickly saw that Savannah was the better place for her and her child. At the beginning of the 1870s, Susie moved to Boston to serve as a domestic for a wealthy white family. While in Boston, she met Russell L. Taylor, a native Georgian, and she married him on April 29, 1879. She remained in Boston for the rest of her life, with only occasional visits to Georgia. In 1890, she wrote her reminiscence, called, quote, "My Life in Camp with the 33rd United States Colored Troops, late 1st South Carolina Volunteers." This book was privately published in 1902. Susie King Taylor died in 1912 in Boston. Her husband also died the same year, but we don't know the exact date. She was inducted in 2018 into the Georgia Women of Achievement Hall of Fame. Now, this is the last one. Nora Fontaine Maury Davidson was born on February 19, 1836 in Petersburg, Virginia. Little is known about her younger years, but we do know she was homeschooled, and we know that she never married. During the Civil War years, Nora worked in local hospitals and in Popular Lawn Hospital in Petersburg as the linen matron. In late 1864, Nora established a school for young girls, and she served as its principal and teacher for almost 60 years, retiring in 1923. She died in 1929. Davidson was one of the charter members of the Petersburg Ladies Memorial Association, organized on May 6, 1866. This association took as its objective the reburial of Confederate soldiers who had fallen on the battlefield around Petersburg. The Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg became their final resting place. After the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Davidson took the children on a field trip to Blandford Cemetery to decorate the graves of the Confederate soldiers. One such soldier was her brother, Charles Davidson, a member of Graham's Horse Artillery, who died on December 25, 1863. Now, legend has it that Union General John A. Logan, a wife, was visiting the Blandford Cemetery on June 9, 1868, and she saw the school children putting flowers and flags on the graves of the Confederate soldiers. Upon Mary Logan's return to Washington, she told her husband what she had seen at Blandford Cemetery, and she said that these ceremonies brought forth her emotions. General Logan, now commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, issued an order establishing a National Decoration Day, which was later passed by Congress. Today it's known as Memorial Day. In 2014, a book was published by author Daniel Wellware and Richard Gardner. In this book, The Genesis of the Memorial Day Holiday in America, Wellware and Gardner proved that the Memorial Day holiday was actually started in Georgia in 1866, and that Davidson was in response to that Georgia event. So those are the ladies today I've selected, and I'll take any questions that you have. I probably haven't got too much time.
A few
Yes.
minutes.
I must say, in watching all of these tremendous women, over the years, we did not invite women into the professions. And I can say that by describing my 1971 law class, which had less than 10 women throughout all of the class. And today, you would find many law schools that are at least 50-50,
Yeah.
and maybe even more than that on the women's side.
So it took a long time.
And in the medical field, I've enjoyed over the years being served by many women doctors. And I'm in good shape.
Right. Any other questions? All right, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob.
All right.
And I think it's very, very important to cover history like this, because it's not all battles. There were a lot of people on the home front, and of course, a lot of these ladies were both on the home front as well as the battle front. But history continues to be written, and I think we should all approach that with open minds and learn something new as often as we can. So thank you very much for coming today, and I'm sorry that a view of these tables might have led you to believe that we were feeding you today. But in any event, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you next month. And then please do remember that you do need to keep time in mind in making reservations for the dinner and lunch. Okay? Thank you very much. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.